Welcome and good morning. What a blessing to be together. And today we start a new series, Being Faithful to God. And that is being faithful to God's call. So we're going to be in 1 Samuel for the next 5 weeks. So if you are borrowing one of the guest Bibles, page 418, will get you where we're starting. But it's the idea of being faithful to God's call. And so just 5 sections as we go through. And I'll bring that back. From desperation to dedication is today's sermon topic. How the connection that we have there. So the new series is about being faithful to God's call because God is faithful. Amen. Amen. God is faithful. It is His character. It is His nature. It is who He is. So we have a number of passages that then say if God is this way, God is faithful, then we are also called to be faithful. The aspect of faithfulness that I want to look at through the series is faithful to a calling from God or by God to do something. What does life look like when God leads, when He has control? What's kind of His general or specific plan for life and our lives in particular? And that can start really early. The book is called Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel is what we have in our Bibles, but they're probably together. But before there is a Samuel, there is a Hannah. So before we start studying through Samuel, we got to get a Samuel. So how did Samuel even come into being, and how does that affect a call and a calling? So it's Hannah's prayer. She's desperate. But in that desperation, she makes a dedication. And so we're going to learn from that. So 1 Samuel chapter 1, 1 through 20. We'll be looking at a fair bit of text here. The power of persistent prayer and God's faithfulness in answering. We're talking about those deep, groaning, heartache type of prayer that Hannah presents. Just from the bottom of the soul presentation to God. And then God's answering of that. And there's a New Testament connection as well in Luke 1, 13 through 17, the birth of John the Baptist. Somebody else that is prayed for, God blesses, and then provides a calling to as well. And those connected together. So 1 Samuel is a pivotal book in the Old Testament. It transitions Israel from a tribal confederation into a monarchy. It covers the rise and the fall of key figures like Samuel, of course, called 1st and 2nd Samuel. But we're reading about the kingship of Saul and David. It reflects on God's sovereignty, that is His ability to be above everything and to be a God of all power. His leadership and human character. How do these people fall in, ask for God's presence and guidance, and how do they go against it, and how does God deal with that? Samuel is the last judge and a prophet. He plays a crucial role in Israel's transition. He anoints Saul as the first king, but Saul's disobedience leads to his own downfall. David is a young shepherd. He's chosen by God to succeed Saul. David's humility and faith in God contrast with Saul's pride and fear, demonstrating God's preference for obedience over outward appearance or status. So there's these themes of leadership that go through the book as well. Saul's failure highlights the importance of humility and obedience to God's command, while David's success shows how God elevates those that trust Him. So how do we follow, and what type of leadership are we looking for? It's a book that talks about God's control over history and human affairs, reminding readers that God's plan prevails even when human leaders fail. Like Saul really messes things up, but God continues to work through things. And there's some good themes in the book about faith in adversity. David's reliance on God during his trials, including his time fleeing from Saul, exemplifies how faith sustains us during hardship. So we have some real people going through real things with God trying to transition them from one stage of leadership to another. But why study a book like this today? Why take a look at What are some of the ways that it could help us as a congregation or help us as individuals? Well, 1 Samuel teaches that leadership rooted in God's will, personal integrity, and faith in adversity are essential for serving God's purposes. It challenges believers to trust in God's timing and guidance, especially when circumstances seem uncertain. Any part of your life where circumstances seem uncertain? Where things just, I wonder what's next, or how things are going, or where am I at? Well, this 1 Samuel helps us to put confidence in who God is. It helps us to be spiritual leaders for those that are seeking spiritual guidance from us, and to trust in spiritual leaders as people to go to in times of transition and say, can we talk this through? What are you seeing? And having that spiritual partnership is all important in 1 Samuel. So I've structured it into 5 sermons. We're talking today about the birth of the prophet. We're getting to how Samuel comes into this. Hannah's prayer from desperation to dedication. And then next week is the call of Samuel. He's just as a young child, hearing God's voice in a noisy world. Does that one kind of sound like it might be relevant? Hearing God's voice in a noisy world. And you see how we can tie that into Thanksgiving. The world's got all this going on, but are we thankful for who God is? Are we trying to hear Him in a noisy and distracting world? So we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 3 in that. And then we're going to go into Israel demands a king, rejecting God as king, the danger of conformity. Also a pretty important topic. What happens if you just go the way of the world? Well, there's warnings. 1 Samuel 8, and the rise and fall of Saul, a king like the nations, the tragic tale of Saul. Wah, wah, wah. Sounds like a mini-series. 1 Samuel 15, and then we're going to finish up with David and Goliath. Pretty good section all from 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Facing giants, trusting in God's strength. So I see some benefits of the series. I see where we can go, and just highlighting some of these sections could be a benefit to us. So thanks in advance for joining me on my mental journey through 1 Samuel. Hopefully it's a benefit to you as well. But the link in those 5 sermons in 1 Samuel is that we can see a call from God to these people which could have brought great blessings from God in His guidance and protection as those who received the call. They're brought forward to be faithful to God. And there's a specific call of the moment to say, God is asking you to do this. God is preparing you to do that. And the ones that were faithful to the call have the blessing. The ones that rejected the call not only brought consequence on themselves, but consequence on others. And God calls us forward in faith today. And maybe these passages will help us to remember to be faithful in our response. You might not be called like King Saul or King David, but you are called to be faithful. And that faithfulness makes a difference to people around us. It's a good reminder today. So Samuel is an answer to Hannah's prayer. Today we're talking about the power of persistent prayer and God's faithfulness in answering. The call to serve that Samuel is given comes from a call to God for a son. Hannah is praying for a son. Hannah is Samuel's mother. Hannah called out to God, and Samuel was the answer to the call and the prayer that was offered. But then she offered the answer back to God so that God could call Samuel into service. So I put it this way. The answer to the call was given back to God and was given a calling. God, I would like this. God blesses it, and then the answer gets rededicated back to God. Now think of the importance of that. God, I would like good health. If God answers that, how do you rededicate it so that it serves God? What are you asking for, and how do we rededicate it? So a good lesson for us to learn as well. This has an account of the power of prayer. Because things were not good. You think back to the time in the history, the plight of the barren. Hannah's barrenness led to deep distress and societal shame, similar to Elizabeth's situation in Luke chapter 1, when God answers that call with a son named John, who's a cousin of Jesus. He was known as the baptizer. So John the Baptist is also an answer to prayer, a prayer about being barren and how that was important to them to have children, and God answering that fervent prayer. But in each of these cases, they go from desperation to dedication. Like Elizabeth, Hannah's desperation leads her to fervent prayer, vowing to dedicate her child to God if he answers. So God, if you answer, then I will offer that answering back to you. So we're going to start in the New Testament. I already told you we were going to be in Samuel, but actually, in Luke chapter 1, 8 through 17, it says, once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as a priest before God, he was chosen by lot, or by, drawing of names kind of a thing, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right hand of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid. Zechariah, your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He'll be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink. This is something we'll talk about next week. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to wisdom of righteousness, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So there's a prayer with Zechariah and Elizabeth that gets answered in John the Baptist being able to come and prepare the way like Elijah for the coming of Jesus. But the answer to the prayer blessed not only them as a family, but it blessed the nation, because then people were ready for Jesus. Pretty interesting, fervent prayer that God answers, but not just to bless the individual, but to see where that answer can go and be a future blessing. So let's turn back time to go back to 1 Samuel and Hannah's prayer and get into that emotional connection that she's going through. And I like how the text gives us some of these clues, some of these sentences in here that can help us relate and emotionally connect as well to what's going on. Because this is definitely a prayer with passion. Hannah prays with earnestness, reflecting the importance of persistent prayer. Another passage we could have considered today is Luke 18, 1 through 8, about the value of not just praying once, but having it in your heart and praying persistently. Not to convince God so much as to say to yourself that this is important. This is important to me because I'm asking more than once. Persistent prayer reminds us of that, and it gives us time to think about when God answers. If he answers the way that I want, how do I dedicate that answer? Whereas a one-off prayer, you might not have that same time. But persistent prayer allows us time to think through how we're going to respond. So let's get into the text in 1 Samuel 1, 1 to 28. Already we get into some complications. There was a certain man from Rephaim, a Zuphite. But the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and 1 Chronicles 6, 26 and 27 and 33 through 35 say from a different area, but slightly, to us, it just looks like slightly different spelling, right? Rephaim, Zuphim. But that's going to be a bit significant in next week's discussion about his ancestry. Samuel's heritage then determines how he can serve the Lord. So that's... These passages are important, but we're not going to deal with them today. Anyways, there was a certain man from the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Elkanah, son of Jerome, son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. So can go back and track the history of who had who, and you know for sure who you're talking about. He had 2 wives, not something recommended or encouraged by God, but certainly something recorded here. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. So that's an important factor because of what comes next. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at, see, that's different than Jerusalem, at Shilo, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests to the Lord. We're going to be introduced to Hophni and Phinehas and Eli more next week. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah, to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her. So that's an important note in the text, because he loved her. And the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. See even the way that that's worded? Her rival, provoking and irritating. Do you like provoking and irritating people that set themselves up to be your rival? I don't. I don't think Hannah did either. But now get into this. Not only is she barren, but she's bothered, picked on, irritated. This went on year after year. So now we have a custom of it. Like, it's just a sore spot. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Just picking at her, making it worse. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Now those are all good questions if you're going to listen to the answer. Can you explain to me what's going on? I love you. I care for you. What are you going through? But then let's see the line at the bottom. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Is a little, put yourself emotionally in that spot. That's the answer. Not exactly comforting. So with this, having a rival, being irritated, asking God, having some support of your husband, but he doesn't understand. He doesn't get it. Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shilo, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will be ever used on his head. So there's a lot going on here. Praying at Shilo, at the temple, and Eli, the priest, sees what's going on. She's weeping bitterly, that's the part. Verse 12 says, as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Then we have another assumption. Eli thought she was drunk. And that thought that she was drunk sitting outside the temple irritates him enough, or enters into a conversation that says, and said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. But ends up being a conversation that's important. Because she says, not so, my lord. Hannah replied, I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. So can you kind of make some emotional, logical connection here? This is like desperate, deep, honest prayer. Eli, being the priest, answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. Now that could be a significant line as well, because the prayer is answered. She said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went away and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. And the other side of this, the rival, can no longer irritate her, because God has heard and at least the priest has said. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. Heard the prayer, answered the prayer. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him, guess what? 1 Samuel. No. Or just Samuel. Samuel sounds like heard by God. Because I was heard by God, that's the answer. And that's his name. Saying, because I asked the Lord for him. Now I want to stop just for a moment here and think of this. Deep anguish, praying to God. God answers the prayer. She becomes pregnant. She gives birth to a son. She has what she asked for. Do you remember what the second part was? She'll dedicate him. But God just gave her the son that she's been praying for. Do you follow through? Does she follow through? Yeah. The next part is, we have an answer to the call of God. You're asking for God for something so big in your life and God answers, but do you now just hold it back and say, thank you for the answer? Or can you let it go to rededicate it? God, thank you for blessing me with, now it's yours. It was yours, you gave it to me, and I give it back to you. Like, there's a stage and a state of this. Being faithful to God, who is always faithful. But that trust of letting go again. The next part shows Hannah fulfilling her promise. And Samuel, he is being dedicated. Now he's just a small kid. When her husband Elkanah went up with his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I'll take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there. How long? Always. But after he's weaned, she has 2, 3, maybe stretch it out to 4 years. She doesn't have long to be with him. Do what seems best to you, her husband Elkanah told her. Stay here until you've weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was. I like that line. Along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah, 36 pounds or 16 kgs of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shilo. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to them. Now, I think this is interesting in a variety of ways. Does Eli know what's next? Has he been forewarned? By the way, when my son is weaned, I'm going to drop him off for you. So she shows up with the sacrifice and the child and says to Eli, pardon me, my Lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he'll be given over to the Lord. And he, Samuel, worshiped the Lord there. Eli just got himself a 3-year-old. He's already got 2 sons. She goes home without Samuel. He stays at the temple and he lives there. She can come back and forth and visit, but usually it's just a yearly trip. She prayed so earnestly for a son, a child, but she immediately, even before he was born, dedicated him to God so that he would be raised under God's care. And, in this case, raised in a temple. That's a tough story. I can understand a partial vow. You know, like, we'll be here yearly. But to walk away without your child? That's a promise. With the intent that God can make a better blessing of him to others if I let him go. Wow. Hannah promises to dedicate Samuel to God, similar to how John the Baptist was set apart for God's purpose. But in both ways, these two were dedicated to God along with others, and God blesses that dedication and benefits way more than the original family. Benefits the nation. A lot of Old Testament history would be different without Samuel. A lot of New Testament's different without John the Baptist. But because these women, because these families dedicated their children, and God fulfilled the promise, and they were rededicated, we have blessings from that. God was faithful in answering the prayer. God honors Hannah's faith. He grants her request. There's a Psalm 34:4 that says, "Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." What she desired deeply was a son, and God answered that. But that answer was only for a short time, for them to live together. And the New Testament connection is God answers the prayer of Zechariah and Elizabeth. So it wasn't just once. God answers prayer. There's continued faithfulness. We need dedication to God when calling to God or when answering his prayer. As believers, we are to pray persistently and trust God's timing. We make the call and be ready to answer when God answers it. We show that in our prayers, and we show it in our dedication. And what's the next one? The rededication. Like Hannah, we're blessed and a blessing when we dedicate our blessings back to God for his glory. So, asking it this way, what do you consider a blessing? Careful how you answer. Whatever you consider as a blessing from God, do you also take the time to rededicate it back to God? Do you consider your car a blessing, your home a blessing, the food that you eat, your health, your time, your faith, fellowship? What do you consider a blessing, and what do you rededicate back to God to use to make a bigger blessing? As in seed given and seed planted. They did this with their children to dedicate them to God to be a bigger blessing. How do you use our blessings to be a benefit to others? That's a lesson we can learn from this, or think about how do we apply it. But there's also the lesson from the desperation to the joy. And then I'm going to suggest to another desperation. Well, a challenge. After the rededication, she's got to go home without Samuel and work through that. And remember, but I did dedicate him for a bigger purpose. There's transformation from sorrow to joy through the answered prayer. Hannah's prayer moves her from desperation to dedication, and life is often lived with both sides at once, isn't it? There's things that are in desperation and the things that are in dedication. And life is about back and forth between the two. Because today's text in the series is intended to call us to a response. How and when do we trust God with our deepest needs and dedicate your life to his purpose? What do we go all in with? What helps you call out to God, and what helps you be ready to respond to his calling? What are you desperately asking God for? But then what are you going to do with it? It's a challenge. But that's God being faithful, and then we're being faithful as well. What helps you to call out to God? It's because I trust in him, because he does love. And what helps you be ready to respond? There's a lot of things. We consider it. Our Thanksgiving sermon next week is the call of Samuel, hearing God's voice in a noisy world. Now we see how the life of dedication in Samuel happens, how he learns to know God and trust God so that he can make them known. Thank you for your time and attention. Hope this series is a benefit to you. Thank you for those that have joined us online as well.